Welcome to a new episode of the CIRAN podcast, reconciling two societal needs, resource extraction and nature conservation. We are Anita Stein and
Luís Rosendo.
And together with our invited experts, we are exploring how Europe balances resource extraction and nature conservation during the energy and environmental transitions. CIRAN is more than a podcast. It's a project funded by the European Union. Today, our focus is on funding critical mineral supply chains.
And to help us understand the challenges behind these topics, we have with us Abigail Hunter, the Executive Director of SAFE's Ambassador Alfred Hoffman Jr. Center for Critical Mineral Strategy.
Previously, Abigail served as Director of International Affairs and Partnerships within the Minerals Center. In this role, she nurtured existing and new SAFE partnerships to advance sustainable and ethical supply chains amongst allies and like-minded countries. Before joining SAFE full-time, Abigail headed federal government affairs for Quebec for nearly 3 years as the senior attachée in Washington, D.C. Abigail completed her master's in sustainable energy at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Together, we will delve into the complexities of funding critical mineral supply chains.
Okay, thank you, Abigail, for joining us on CIRAN podcast. I would like to start to ask you what financial challenges face critical mineral supply chains in the US and in Europe.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. It's a good question. When we talk about critical mineral supply chains in the United States and Europe, one of the biggest hurdles right at the get-go is the sheer amount of money it takes to get these projects off the ground. We're looking at billions of dollars to explore, extract, and process minerals. There was a recent Bloomberg NEF report that said that the critical minerals sector needed over $30 billion of investment by 2030 just to meet the energy manufacturing demand for Europe and the United States. And that doesn't even include demand drivers like AI or robotics, as well as the materials needed to replenish our military stockpiles. But more than that price tag today is the market dynamics. A mining company exec who I work with is constantly using the example, and I'll show you guys visually, but I know the listeners won't see this, but the demand is all the way up here, very high, the attention to these minerals, the political engagement around critical mineral supply chains, but the market is continuously down here, much lower. When the prices are so low as they are today, it's not, for many of these commodities, it's not economic for us to increase production. And some of that is inherent. They're known for their volatility, these markets. And it's also inherent in how the capital markets function around them. These projects take years, sometimes decades to develop. And then during that time period, prices for minerals can wildly swing. For instance, cobalt and lithium prices, and nickel for that matter, have seen dramatic price fluctuations in recent years. Western markets also aren't really well equipped to deal with the volatility. In the US context, maybe a little bit different than Europe's taxonomy, but following the 2008 financial crisis, there was severe tightening of credit conditions, and that led to an enduring shift in how financial institutions evaluate capital-intensive and long-term projects. So investors now prioritize projects and opportunities that offer higher returns in short-term windows over these longer extended payback periods that are also kind of uncertain. And then on top of all of that, there's the geopolitics. Chinese dominance in the midstream, the processing sector, which is well known today, handling 70 to 90% of minerals like lithium, cobalt, rare earth element, refining, processing. These firms also have a strong grip on upstream extraction. There's a report that cited Chinese entities spent $16 billion in foreign mines in 2023 alone. And then they're following through very effectively with the Made in China 2025 commitment of having embedded materials lead to a stronger manufacturing sector in China. So becoming playing an ever-growing dominant role in downstream manufacturing in things like batteries, electric vehicles, and even ICE vehicles. The monopsony dynamics that this presents make investors very nervous. And the ones that do invest in the critical minerals or commodity spaces often focused on more diverse markets that have higher returns like gold and copper today. That was a big headline at the big Prospectors Developers Association conference. So very, very complicated and many financial challenges that we have to contend with.
Thank you, Abigail. Could you perhaps explain a bit how the public and the private sectors are collaborating to fund critical minerals projects?
Yeah, first I'll say that public-private collaboration is absolutely essential to ensure that these projects move forward efficiently and align with our national and security interests, because there is a market failure today. Western governments cannot take on that scale of investment required alone, and we need the private sector companies to finance, develop, and execute critical minerals projects. Recognizing all of this, there's been a couple of programs that have been established, and I admit I'm definitely more familiar with the ones in the United States, but really important to emphasize both sides of the Atlantic are trying very hard to drive more private sector investment into minerals projects. I'll give two US examples. MP Materials is a rare earth project at Mountain Pass, California, and during, I believe, the first Trump administration, they received a $9.6 million in funding from the Defense Production Title III Act. And this was supposed to help them recommission their rare earth separation facility and reestablish domestic processing capacity. And while that's a relatively small amount compared to the billions that we've seen other projects receive, like the second example I'll give, it was really important to signal to the private sector that this project was worth backing, given the momentum needed to raise additional capital. And MP has also done an incredible job using that first funding opportunity, working more with the government and raising a lot on their own. They started operations in 2023, that this specific plant, the separation plant, and has since allowed the U.S. to become a net exporter of neodymium praseodymium oxide. And then another good example with U.S. government support is the Thacker Pass project, which has General Motors offtake. Thacker Pass is a lithium clay project in Nevada. And one of the conditions for the General Motors second tranche of investment in this lithium project was successful execution of the DOE low-cost loan. The finalization of the loan also unlocked additional GM investment, which is obviously what you want to see. And now Thacker Pass is on track to produce enough lithium for 1 million vehicles when fully operational. And then as of maybe a week or so ago, they actually closed their recent equity funding raise with, I think, $250 million from Orion. So again, you're seeing that really effective offtake catalyzation and future further investment catalyzation from this low finance loan. And then I understand in Europe, the Critical Raw Materials Act has been designed to streamline permitting for strategic projects, addressing a big bottleneck we see in project development, and has driven funding through EIT raw materials, for example, and investment. On a cross-Atlantic collaborative stage, along with other allied countries, you have programs like the Mineral Security Partnership, which has 14 country members, and the European Union that are all working together to drive investment towards strategic projects and align their efforts to diversify supply chains while maintaining standards. They're designed to really help decrease the financial and political risks affiliated with these projects and band together, because obviously we all have the same very, very concentrated critical mineral supply chains that create challenges for our manufacturers and for our mineral producers domestically, who have to play on a distorted playing field. The MSP is still moving on under Korean leadership, despite being originally created by the United States, but also has great EU support with DG Trade implicated in the MSP Forum, kind of offshoot of the Mineral Security Partnership. So that's also promising. And SAFE, our role with the MSP has been actually to bring private sector players to the table in these conversations, knowing how technically complicated and risky these projects are. It's important to infuse private sector advice to ultimately drive that investment that they're seeking to get.
Okay, thank you for enlightening us on that. And what are the key insights that emerge from SAFE's recent research on supply chain funding?
Yeah, we released a report in January, right before the U.S. inauguration, called "Resources for Resources: Financing Critical Mineral Supply Chains." It was really kind of a two-pronged report. The first was to shed light on why investors, private investors, are hesitant to jump into critical minerals projects. And then the second half of the report was how US government programs could work better to address those challenges. Sometimes I feel like my job is a glorified translator between the investors and the policymakers because they speak very different languages. We would hear from investors, you know, we don't understand. There's no government support for these projects. They're so risky. We see the attention, but there's not enough to get us there. And then from the government decision makers, they'd say, what does it even mean to defray your risk? And, we have all these billions, hundreds of billions of dollars of programs that exist. How are they not fitting together? And so the report's intended to simultaneously educate so that we can start the conversation from a more informed level and actually really crack at this problem better. In the report, we first tried to categorize the types of risks in these projects. We talked about technical risks. Finding and developing minerals projects is incredibly complex. For example, 1 in 10,000 mineral prospects actually become a mine, and we hear a lot about the prospects, but less about kind of the ones that actually get into that production phase. Those are tough odds for investors. There's the financial risks, the billions capital expenditure needed upfront with long-term repayment windows, as we talked about before, also within a highly volatile market. And then you have risks affiliated with compliance, so getting permits in challenging permitting regimes, maintaining labor and environmental standards. And then there's the geopolitical risks. Caused by an over-concentrated supply chain, but also the ongoing tensions as countries try to unwind that concentration. OECD report found that there were 16,000 new trade provisions in export provisions related to critical minerals supply chains recently. And that's not just, China, as we hear about a lot with the export controls, but that's resource-rich countries enforcing more export restrictions to get more value add domestically, like the DRC has been doing a lot recently. Together, these risks bring a high degree of uncertainty for the return on investment, the ultimate driving factor that investors, financiers think about. And then we go through at length kind of the different US government programs, and maybe not as worth it for us to dive into those because some of them are very much under review by the Trump administration on whether or not they'll move forward or in what form they'll move forward, right? There's some changes. But really, it's not financial data or numeric insights from that report, but really kind of trying to lay out for readers, here are the challenges that we're facing, here are the programs today, where do we go from here, with some recommendations on our ideas on that.
Thank you. Very interesting indeed. And then, to continue, according to you, which kind of innovative financing models could perhaps help to solve this existing investment gap that we see in the critical minerals sector?
Yeah, lots of interesting ideas here. The report suggests some that combine the best of public oversight, engagement, support, long-term windows that the private sector or public sector can take, and then the private sector expertise. One idea that already is existing in some jurisdictions is creating specialized investment entities like public-private partnerships that can manage risk and capital more effectively together. These are similar to funds like in France, and also how the United States works with TechMet to draw on public resources for stability while tapping into, again, the private sector expertise for efficiency. These firms that, like TechMet and Infravia, to give the US and France example, don't just bring in money, they offer strategic insights, market access, industry connections, and those are all very crucial in a highly complex and volatile sector. For the United States, TechMet has invested in projects in the US, Europe, Africa, and Brazil, leveraging that industry knowledge and those resources to really push forward on these projects that may have been previously overlooked or not viable without that government support. Another good example, again, is the LPO, the Loan Programs Office, ability to provide low-cost debt finance that covers up to 80% of project costs. This significantly lowers the financial barrier for companies, encouraging them to engage in more high-risk ventures that otherwise maybe they wouldn't have considered. And then a third innovative model that we talk about in the report is really honing in on export credit agencies and development finance institutions, particularly in their ability to provide guarantees or insurance for high-risk projects. These can help reduce the perceived risk for private investors and encourage more capital flows, particularly like political risk in specific jurisdictions. The political risk insurance that U.S. Development Finance Corporation has utilized has been dusted off recently, and we think it's really important to help with garnering attention and private sector engagement to projects. And then, we can't talk about creative financial tools today without engaging in the whole price support debate. There's a lot of interest, and they're very distinct kind of tools, but we can lump them together a little bit for ease of our conversation. But providing direct price support for projects like contract for differences, providing price insurance for projects, or, supporting projects through certainty of offtake, through joint purchasing, which the EU has been navigating, and then differently, the stockpiling approach. All of these have been really getting attention in Brussels, Ottawa, Canberra, Washington, D.C., as we try to help ex-China producers really come online in that tough, low price environment that we see today. The report delineates kind of our outlines of these different concepts and also puts in, some of our, I would say, our scrutiny over them, because we think particularly on the price support side, it's really an expensive way to deal with these problems. The invisible hand for these small market cap markets really whips about, right? And so hard to kind of control for that if the goal is price stability. Further, the reason investors get involved in these projects is for the upside, right? And so if you're trying to do price floor models to support things, you're circumscribing the upside that investors get. And that would really be challenging for some of these companies and how they work with their investors. Stockpiling challenges are also complicated, right? What are we storing? What is the shelf life on what we're storing? Who's managing these stockpiles? The private sector, the public sector? Do we have enough expertise to be able to do that? Are they real stockpiles, like tangible ones? Or are they virtual? A lot of kind of unknowns there. We have stockpile programs to look at and evaluate here. In the US, we have our national defense stockpile. But we could strengthen these tools certainly to be more effective. It's just whether or not they're the right signal to the market. That's yet to be seen. So I'll stop there because that's a lot of ideas, right? And we're very good at think tanks to kind of throw out a lot of ideas and test them with the public.
Yes, you mentioned a lot of ideas, and you also talked about the mineral security partnership. And I don't know if you heard about, but one of the promising lithium factories or battery lithium factories in Europe went bankrupt, Northvolt. Following the challenges you mentioned in your answer before, what role can these international partnerships can play to strengthen these mineral security?
Yeah, so there's a lot of multilateral groups that are trying to tackle this question, and then there's a lot of really strong bilateral and trilateral groups, and I think they can be used in different ways. On the multilateral front, we have the Mineral Security Partnership, we have the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, we have the Conference on Critical Minerals and Materials, CCMM, formerly known as the Triad. The Quad has been put on a critical minerals spotlight with the Unleashing American Energy Executive Order early in the Trump administration. There's more. We have a really upsettingly complicated chart that we use at SAFE to kind of showcase how many groups that are G7 plus that are trying to tackle these issues already exist. I think while these groups are aplenty, I think what's important about them is the attention that they give to the issue. We all share the same common geopolitical competitor here in China that has been very successful, not by accident, and really dominating across these supply chains. And so it's incumbent upon us to be able to try to support one another in creating an ex-China market for these projects to come online and for these supply chains to ultimately be more diverse. Otherwise, we'll contend with what we've already seen, which is levels of economic coercion when it comes to over-reliance on one entity for these commodities. We saw it in 2010 with the rare earths crisis. And that's really what prompted the creation of the Conference on Critical Minerals and Materials, formerly the Triad. And, we're seeing it today with very targeted export bans to U.S. military, but then ever-growing kind of export controls generally that require companies, European, American companies, companies all over the world, to submit licenses to be able to access materials that give, the Chinese government a far better understanding of what we're using the commodities for, right? So it behooves us all, through whatever G7 plus forum, to come together as consuming countries to be able to really say, okay, we need to work on creating an ex-China supply chain for these projects, because it's a common ground that we all have to deal with. The other reason it's really important is because geology is stubborn. It is where it is. And so, as the world does move towards a more inward-looking, isolationist fashion, which, is a response of many different kind of globalization variables, it's really important that we still engage internationally, because the rocks are where the rocks are. So I think that's been a useful stuff for work on. Even with contacts that we have within the new Trump administration, there's this recognition that we do need to engage with resource-rich countries, as well as produce as much as we can alone, right? This is really incumbent upon us to get the resources we have out of our own subsoil too, to be successful. And then on the bilateral point, I think maybe that's where, the engagement that the Trump administration's been doing with resource-rich countries has really come into play. You've seen this today with the Ukraine deal. The Trump administration has been working with President Zelensky on, as well as interest in engaging with Greenland on resources. Again, I don't think it's maybe going to function as simply as what the administration had originally envisioned, but the concept, the contours of critical minerals as a pillar of foreign policy and a bilateral engagement, I think, is the trend to focus on, right? And it's not a bad one, because we need to get these projects in production for more diverse and secure supply chains. And there's economic development benefits to these countries, if done properly, that they can unlock if we get that right support from governments.
Thank you. And then I'd also be curious to hear your perspectives on how regions that are considered as resource-rich but underdeveloped could better benefit from their wealth in critical minerals.
Yeah, I think first, it's important to emphasize the critical minerals projects challenges are not just like getting the rocks out of the ground and beneficiating them right on site or refining them right on site. Really, the value is in your ability, even if you transform them much further, to move them to other places to sell to those markets, right? It's the kind of promise of that economic development potential. And that's where, the Libido corridor that was supported by the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment is really important, because if you don't have the infrastructure to move the materials, then investors aren't going to look at the project and say, okay, this is a great asset all on its own, but if we can't sell it to anybody, then whatever format they transform it into, then maybe we don't move forward with this. The same can be true with energy infrastructure. If you have, these are really, really energy intensive processing projects, if that's the phase they want to go towards in resource-rich countries, but without that abundant and affordable energy infrastructure, it's going to be really challenging to transform those materials effectively. So those are kind of the additional, I would say, variables we need to think about when it comes to economic development potential from these resources. The other aspect of this that I think is really important is there's a very clear ambition to have the full value chain in any jurisdiction, right? Like I talked to the Kentucky governor's staff maybe a year or two ago, and they said Kentucky is going to have soup to nuts the entire battery supply chain in the state of Kentucky. And that's the same thing we hear from Zambia, right? But to have an entire supply chain for something as complicated and, sprawling as many, like all the different 5 major materials that go into a battery and the downstream manufacturing infrastructure, it's not really feasible, and it's not actually economically efficient, right? We should be leveraging the comparative advantage that different jurisdictions have, more than just obviously what China has been able to garner, because we need the diversity to really lean into this problem. So strength and kind of the economic coordination with your neighbors, I think is really important, whether you're a U.S. state or sub-Saharan Africa. And I also think, lastly, for kind of the countries that are really trying to develop their economies through minerals, is you need to go step by step down the supply chain. Like, even if you do kind of have these longer term full supply chain ambitions, you have to start somewhere, and you have to work. If it's there's a really good MSP project example with germanium coming out of waste piles in the DRC. Umicore has been engaged there, and they're starting by, doing germanium to germanium concentrate, but they want to go further in the DRC. But they need the skilled labor to be developed. They need the infrastructure to be developed. So it's okay to have these longer term goals, but then work segment by segment of the supply chain before you get there.
Yes, interesting perspective indeed. You mentioned already a lot of risks involved in the current funding approaches, and there is a question that how can they be mitigated, which somehow you mentioned already. I don't know if you allow me to add a point in this question, which is how about communities and environmental protected areas? How are these risks for also for the investments? And in your opinion, how can they be mitigated too?
Yeah. So in the report, we really tried to, when we divided the risks up into the technical, financial, compliance, and geopolitical, we really tried to look within those risks and lean into, okay, what really is within the government's span of control to mitigate versus what can the private sector come in and do what they do best on, right? So I'll start with compliance, because that's kind of where your question stood, and that's where more we have the permitting regimes and the environmental and labor standards and social standards. When we talk about permitting and social acceptability of projects, one phrase we heard from investors that's outlined in the report that I constantly cite is, you need objectivity of process, you need clarity of process, and you need ability to actually execute the process. And different countries stack up very differently against this three-pronged test. The clarity of process is really where you define the stakeholders that should be at the table and engage them early and often, because social acceptability is a dynamic thing. And so if you're constantly guessing at who should be a stakeholder in your project, and it's so impossible to kind of decide if this community, 100 miles away versus the one that's right on site, that's going to be really challenging for a project to develop, right? And you're going to be pulled in a direction away from actually getting your project under development. So if the government can come in and play that role of clearly defining, these are the stakeholders and here's how you engage them, the private sector, I think, would really be more effective at leaning in and doing what they do best. And I can go through the other ones on technical risks. We focused a lot on the vulnerabilities of the early stage and exploration and project development, where projects can face delays, cost overruns due to unforeseen geological challenges or difficulties scaling technologies. And so we really hone in on more research and development and technology engagement, as well as infrastructure improvements to mitigate those risks, so that the government can reduce the uncertainties that deter the private sector investment, And that's really important for the early stage projects because you're pre-revenue, right? You're not producing anything. You're taking on all this risk to see if you have something that is geologically significant and economically viable, but you don't have a source of revenue at that time, right? Similarly, the financial risks that are acute at that time, and then the price risks that we've seen, that we've talked about on this podcast. The report there recommends strengthening federal financial tools like loans, production tax credits in particular, where you let the private sector pick winners and remove government from that equation. And then some direct grants in instances where, we're just really not competitive compared to Asia. The CapEx can be, 3 to 5 times higher. We already talked about compliance risk. And then, the geopolitical risks are a little bit more daunting, but I would say that the certainty and clarity of the market signal is really important there, right? With the 30D clean vehicle tax credit, you were trying to embed incentives for downstream industry in having resilient and secure ex-China supply chains. So they did that by having 2 sides of the tax credit. One was North American battery manufacturing and recycling, and the other side of the tax credit was for free trade agreement countries to be, extracting and processing minerals. And then alongside that, you had an increasing threshold of no foreign entity of concern, which was very specifically defined in guidance to try to make sure that you had, again, resilient, secure, and high standard ex-China supply chains as we built this new sector. And instead of becoming beholden to, Chinese entities for the future of electrification. That signal has had a pretty big effect in terms of investments that previously weren't happening, right? In these free trade agreement countries and in North America and the US combined with the production tax credit. So it's really a supply chain incentive, even though the people receiving it at the end and benefiting at the end of the supply chain are the qualified manufacturers. But now we don't know what's going to happen with it, right? And so the geopolitics of this and the politics, frankly, have made this a little bit more uncertain territory and are making investors sit on their hands and wait a little bit at a time that we, need to be moving more urgently on these issues.
Thanks a lot, Abigail. Yeah, I think we are reaching now the end of the podcast. Thanks so much for your contribution.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you for your insightful answers.
This episode was brought to you by CIRAN. CIRAN is an EU-funded project that is investigating how to balance resource extraction and nature conservation.